Settle into the sleepy mind channel. Almost everyone has a bottle of balsamic vinegar somewhere in their kitchen. It may be waiting beside a bottle of olive oil, ready for the next salad, a slice of fresh tomato, or a warm piece of bread. Most of us reach for it without giving it much thought. It is simply another familiar ingredient that has quietly found its place in cupboards around the world. Yet there is another kind of balsamic vinegar that shares little more than its name. Hidden beneath the rooftops of one Italian city are rows of wooden casks, holding a liquid that cannot be rushed, cannot be mass-produced, and cannot be recreated by simply following a recipe. Some of those barrels contain vinegar that has been patiently maturing for decades, growing richer with every passing season. The people caring for them know that the finest reward often belongs to someone who has not even been born yet. Modern life rarely asks us to think that far ahead. We have become accustomed to speed in almost every part of our daily lives. A message crosses an ocean in seconds. A meal can appear at the front door before the evening has hardly begun. If something takes more than a few moments, it often feels as though it has taken too long. That is why the story of traditional balsamic vinegar feels almost unbelievable at first. It belongs to a world where success is measured not by how quickly something can be finished, but by how patiently it is allowed to mature. For the families of Modena, time has never been the enemy. It has always been the master craftsman. If you enjoy videos like these, feel free to like and subscribe. More videos are posted weekly. For all-night listening, be sure to explore our playlists filled with a wide variety of relaxing topics, each one created to help you fall asleep while learning. Tonight, let us step into northern Italy and discover how one of the world's most treasured foods has been shaped by centuries of care, tradition, and an extraordinary respect for time. Long before modern supermarkets lined their shelves with bottles from every corner of the world, the city of Modena was already becoming known for something very special. Nestled within the fertile landscape of northern Italy, this historic city developed a tradition that would eventually earn admiration from chefs, historians, and food lovers across the globe. Yet its beginnings were surprisingly humble. There were no famous brands, no advertising campaigns, and no international awards. There were simply families who understood their vineyards, respected the changing seasons, and believed that nature could accomplish remarkable things if left to work at its own pace. Historical records tell us that valuable balsamic vinegars were already being appreciated during the 11th century. Imagine Europe during that time. Stone castles overlooked the countryside. Monasteries preserved knowledge by carefully copying books by hand. Merchants traveled dusty roads with horses and wagons, carrying cloth, spices, and precious goods from one town to another. In that same world, carefully prepared vinegar from Modena had already earned a reputation worthy of noble households. It was not considered an everyday seasoning. It was something far more precious, often reserved for important occasions and highly respected among wealthy families. It is fascinating that such an admired product began with something so ordinary. Grapes have always been a familiar sight across much of Italy. Vineyards stretch over rolling hills, changing color with the seasons, just as they have for countless generations. Every autumn brings another harvest, another opportunity to gather fruit that has spent the summer soaking in warm sunshine. To most people, grapes become wine, juice, or something to enjoy fresh from the vine. In Modena, however, generations of families discovered another possibility, one that demanded an almost unimaginable amount of patience. The heart of this tradition has never been found inside a grand palace or an impressive factory. Instead, it has always lived inside family homes. Above the living spaces, tucked beneath clay roof tiles, attic rooms became the perfect place for rows of wooden barrels. These were not elegant showpieces displayed for visitors. They were working casks, each one playing its own part in a process that unfolded so gradually it almost seemed invisible. A visitor spending only a few hours inside one of these attic spaces might leave believing nothing at all was happening. Yet every passing day, every change in temperature, and every shifting season quietly contributed to the transformation taking place inside the wood. Families in Modena came to understand that caring for these barrels was about far more than producing food. The barrels themselves gradually became treasured possessions, passed from parents to children with enormous pride. They represented years of careful attention, countless harvests, and the work of relatives whose hands had long since grown still. Every generation accepted responsibility for protecting something they had inherited, while preparing it for those who would one day follow. Looking after the barrels became an act of gratitude toward the past and an act of generosity toward the future. Many listeners today inherit jewelry, photographs, or handwritten letters from older family members. These objects carry memories that cannot easily be replaced. The barrel collections of Modena held that same emotional value. Each cask had its own story. Some had been used by grandparents, others by great-grandparents, and a few had remained within the same family for well over a century. Their surfaces became darker with age, their wood gently shaped by changing weather and years of careful handling. Every mark upon the barrel hinted at another season that had quietly passed. Unlike many modern foods that rely upon precise machinery, computers, and carefully controlled production lines, traditional balsamic vinegar developed through observation rather than automation. Families learn to recognize tiny changes that others might never notice. They understood the character of each barrel. They recognized the subtle influence of changing temperatures beneath the roof. They trusted experience gathered over many lifetimes instead of rushing to find quicker methods. Their greatest tool was not a machine. It was patience supported by careful attention. Visitors are often surprised by how peaceful these attic vinegar lofts feel. Sunlight slips through small windows, creating shifting patterns across rows of well-worn barrels. The scent of aged wood fills the air alongside delicate notes of fruit and vinegar that have slowly developed over many years. Nothing appears hurried. There is no sense that anyone is racing against the clock. Instead, everything seems to exist in harmony with the seasons, allowing nature to perform work that cannot be forced. The countryside surrounding Modena has always offered something that cannot be manufactured inside a factory. It is a landscape where fertile fields, vineyards, and orchards have shared the same horizon for centuries, each season bringing its own familiar rhythm. Spring covers the vines with fresh green shoots. Summer ripens the grapes beneath long days of warm sunshine. Autumn fills the vineyards with harvest, while winter gives the land an opportunity to rest before another growing season begins. These repeating cycles have quietly shaped the lives of local families for generations, creating an environment where patience feels less like a choice and more like a natural way of living. Modena sits in the northern Italian region of Emilia-Romagna, an area that many food historians describe as one of the finest culinary regions anywhere in the world. It is not because the recipes are complicated or extravagant. In fact, many of the region's most celebrated foods are built upon remarkably simple ingredients that have been treated with exceptional care. Local people often believe that if the ingredients are excellent, there is little need to hide them beneath unnecessary decoration. That philosophy appears again and again throughout the region, whether someone is making cheese, curing meat, preparing fresh pasta, or tending a collection of aging vinegar barrels beneath an old roof. To understand why traditional balsamic vinegar developed here rather than somewhere else, it helps to think of Emilia-Romagna as a place where several fortunate conditions came together over many centuries. The land is fertile, supplied by rivers that have nourished agriculture since ancient times. Summers provide generous warmth, while winters become noticeably cooler. Those changing temperatures influence almost every part of rural life, from vineyards and orchards to cheese making and vinegar aging. Nature itself becomes an active participant rather than something people constantly struggle to control. Many travelers arrive in Modena because they have already heard about other famous foods from the region. One of the best known is Parmigiano Reggiano, often called the king of cheeses. Large wheels of this remarkable cheese mature for many months before they are considered ready, developing a rich flavor and a crumbly texture that has become recognized around the world. Much like traditional balsamic vinegar, authentic Parmigiano Reggiano depends upon time just as much as it depends upon skilled craftsmanship. Neither can be hurried without sacrificing the qualities that make them so distinctive. Another celebrated treasure of the region is prosciutto, the delicately cured ham that has become one of Italy's most recognized foods. Once again, patience stands at the center of the process. Carefully selected meat is salted, protected, and then left to mature gradually under carefully monitored conditions. During that time, moisture slowly leaves the meat, while flavor becomes richer and more concentrated. It is another reminder that many of the world's finest foods depend less upon speed than upon restraint. Knowing when not to interfere can be just as important as knowing when to act. The vineyards surrounding Modena have played their own important role in this story for countless generations. Long before anyone thought about producing traditional balsamic vinegar, grapes were already thriving across the countryside. Farmers came to understand which varieties responded best to the local climate and which produced fruit with the qualities they valued most. Over many years, experience shaped their decisions just as surely as written knowledge. Each harvest offered another opportunity to learn from the previous season while preparing for the next. Among the grape varieties most closely connected with traditional balsamic vinegar are Trebbiano and Lambrusco. Although many people recognize Lambrusco because of the sparkling wines that carry the same name, these grapes also play an important role in the production of authentic balsamic vinegar. Trebbiano grapes, meanwhile, have long been appreciated for their balanced character and their ability to provide the natural sugars needed for the slow transformation that follows. Together, these grapes have helped define the flavor of traditional balsamic vinegar for generations. Standing in a vineyard during harvest offers a completely different perspective from seeing a finished bottle resting on a dining table. The grapes hang in heavy clusters beneath broad leaves that have sheltered them throughout the summer. Workers move steadily between the rows, carefully gathering fruit that has spent months developing beneath the Italian sun. There is a feeling of quiet satisfaction because the harvest represents the successful completion of one growing season, while also marking the beginning of another much longer process that has only just begun. It is tempting to forget how dependent every vineyard remains upon nature. A little more sunshine or a little less rainfall can influence the character of an entire harvest. Spring frosts, summer storms, and changing temperatures all leave their own subtle mark upon the fruit. Farmers can guide the vines, prune their branches, and care for the soil, but they cannot command the weather. In many ways, growing grapes teaches the same lesson as aging balsamic vinegar. Success comes from working alongside nature rather than trying to overpower it. When the harvest finally arrives, there is often a sense of celebration mixed with relief. Families gather, baskets fill with freshly picked grapes, and another year of careful work reaches its reward. Yet for those producing traditional balsamic vinegar, the vineyard is only the beginning of a story that will continue for many years to come. The grapes themselves represent possibility rather than completion. They contain the potential for something extraordinary, provided the people caring for them continue to exercise the same patience their ancestors demonstrated centuries earlier. Freshly harvested grapes are where every bottle of authentic traditional balsamic vinegar begins its remarkable life. It is surprising to learn that the process does not start with wine at all. Many listeners naturally assume vinegar must first become wine before it can become vinegar. That may be true for many kinds of vinegar found around the world, but traditional balsamic vinegar follows a very different path. Instead of beginning with fermented wine, it begins with grape must, a simple ingredient that has remained at the heart of this tradition for centuries. The word must may sound unfamiliar at first, yet it describes something wonderfully uncomplicated. Grape must is simply the fresh juice collected immediately after the grapes have been pressed. Before anything else can happen, the fruit is harvested at just the right moment, when natural sugars have reached an ideal balance. The grapes are gently crushed, allowing their sweet juice to flow freely, while the skins, seeds, and stems are carefully separated. What remains is a rich, fragrant juice that still carries everything the vineyard has provided throughout the growing season. Imagine squeezing a perfectly ripe orange into a glass. The juice you pour is fresh, vibrant, and filled with the flavor of the fruit itself. Grape must shares that same sense of freshness, although its character is quite different. It is naturally sweet, smooth, and filled with the concentrated essence of freshly harvested grapes. Before time begins working its quiet magic, this simple juice holds all the potential that will eventually become traditional balsamic vinegar many years later. The quality of the grape must depend entirely upon the quality of the harvest. There is no opportunity to disguise poor fruit later in the process. If the grapes have struggled through difficult weather or have been harvested before reaching full maturity, those shortcomings cannot simply be corrected with additional ingredients. This is one reason vineyard owners devote so much attention to caring for their vines throughout the year. Healthy soil, careful pruning, balanced sunshine, and favorable weather all contribute to producing grapes worthy of becoming traditional balsamic vinegar. Once the fresh juice has been collected, another fascinating stage begins. Instead of allowing the juice to ferment immediately, it is slowly cooked over an open flame. This gentle heating process has remained an essential part of the tradition for generations. Large open vessels allow the juice to warm gradually, never rushing the transformation. As the liquid slowly simmers, water begins to evaporate into the air, while the natural sugars become increasingly concentrated. The room gradually fills with a rich aroma that many families instantly recognize as the beginning of another year's production. It helps to imagine preparing a homemade fruit preserve. At first, the fruit contains a great deal of water, making the mixture light and thin. As gentle heat continues its work, moisture slowly disappears, leaving behind a richer and more concentrated flavor. The same principle applies to grape must, although the process demands careful attention. Too much heat would damage the delicate qualities that make the juice so valuable. Too little would fail to create the concentration needed for the years of aging still to come. Generations of experience have taught experienced producers exactly how patiently this stage must unfold. As water slowly leaves the juice, the natural sweetness becomes more pronounced. The sugars already present inside the grapes are not added by people. They have developed naturally while the fruit ripened beneath the summer sun. Cooking simply concentrates what nature has already created. Every vineyard contributes its own subtle character, influenced by the weather, the soil, and the grape varieties chosen by the family caring for the vines. Those influences remain present long after the cooking has finished, quietly accompanying the vinegar throughout the many years that still lie ahead. One remarkable fact about authentic traditional balsamic vinegar is just how little goes into making it. In an age when many foods contain long lists of ingredients printed in tiny lettering across the back of a label, traditional balsamic vinegar remains wonderfully simple. There are no artificial colors added to deepen its appearance. There are no sweeteners introduced to increase richness. There are no flavorings mixed into the liquid to imitate years of careful aging. Authentic traditional balsamic vinegar contains only cooked grape must. That single ingredient often surprises people who first learn about the process. It almost seems impossible that something with such remarkable depth of flavor could begin with only one carefully prepared juice. Yet simplicity has always been one of the defining characteristics of the finest traditional foods. When outstanding ingredients meet exceptional craftsmanship, there is often very little reason to complicate the recipe. Instead of relying upon numerous additions, families have trusted nature, experience, and patience to perform the work. This philosophy appears throughout many of Italy's greatest culinary traditions. A beautiful loaf of rustic bread may contain little more than flour, water, salt, and yeast. Fresh pasta often requires only flour and eggs. Excellent olive oil begins with carefully harvested olives. Traditional balsamic vinegar follows that same pattern. Rather than adding more ingredients, generations of producers learned how to achieve greater complexity by allowing a single ingredient to evolve naturally over many years. After the cooking has been completed, the concentrated grape must has already begun its long transformation. It is darker than the fresh juice that entered the vessel, richer in natural sugars, and prepared for the next stage of its remarkable life. Yet despite the progress already made, the liquid remains only at the beginning of an extraordinary journey. Years of gradual change still lie ahead before it will resemble the luxurious balsamic vinegar admired around the world. After the grape must has been slowly cooked and concentrated, something equally fascinating begins to unfold. Unlike many modern foods that rely upon carefully measured packets of yeast or specially prepared cultures, traditional balsamic vinegar has long trusted a process that begins naturally. There is no dramatic moment when someone presses a button or pours in a secret ingredient. Instead, the transformation begins almost quietly, guided by microscopic forms of life that have shared the world with us for millions of years. Although invisible to the human eye, these tiny living organisms become some of the most important partners in creating authentic traditional balsamic vinegar. At first, the idea of allowing naturally occurring microorganisms to shape a treasured food may sound surprising. Today, we often hear the word bacteria mentioned only when discussing illness or cleanliness. Yet the natural world is filled with beneficial microorganisms that perform extraordinary work every single day. They help create bread, cheese, yogurt, chocolate, coffee, and countless other foods that many of us enjoy without giving much thought to the remarkable biology taking place behind the scenes. Traditional balsamic vinegar belongs to that same remarkable family of foods where nature quietly performs work that no machine has ever been able to imitate completely. Fermentation is one of humanity's oldest discoveries, even though ancient people could never have explained it using modern science. Thousands of years ago, they simply observed that certain foods changed over time in useful and often delicious ways. Grapes became wine, milk became cheese, dough rose into bread. Vegetables developed new flavors when preserved. Long before anyone understood microorganisms, generations of careful observers recognized that nature itself could become an invaluable partner if treated with respect and patience. Inside the cooked grape must naturally occurring yeasts begin converting some of the grape's sugars into alcohol. This stage unfolds gradually, following the rhythm established by temperature, moisture, and time. Nothing is hurried, because there is no advantage in rushing such delicate work. Every stage prepares the liquid for the next, much like laying the foundation before building the walls of a house. Without a strong beginning, everything that follows becomes less certain. Soon, another remarkable group of microscopic helpers joins the process. These are known as acetic acid bacteria, and they play one of the most important roles in the entire story of traditional balsamic vinegar. While the earlier stage creates alcohol, these beneficial bacteria gradually transform that alcohol into acetic acid, giving vinegar its familiar brightness and character. Although the scientific explanation may sound complicated, the process itself unfolds with remarkable elegance, requiring nothing more than favorable conditions and an abundance of patience. It is fascinating to realize that these tiny organisms have been quietly performing the same task for countless generations. They ask for no instructions, require no complicated machinery, and demand no supervision beyond the thoughtful care provided by experienced families. Given the proper environment, they simply continue doing what nature has prepared them to do. In many ways, the master distiller becomes less of a controller and more of a caretaker, creating conditions where these natural processes can unfold as they have for centuries. Think about learning to play a musical instrument. A beginner may wish to perform a beautiful concerto after only a few lessons, but experience cannot be compressed into a weekend course. Small improvements build upon one another through regular practice until, years later, the musician performs with effortless confidence. Fermentation follows a surprisingly similar pattern. Each tiny change prepares the way for another, creating complexity that could never appear if someone attempted to force the process forward. For generations, families learn to trust these natural transformations through careful observation rather than laboratory instruments. They noticed changes in aroma, texture, and appearance. They recognized when conditions beneath the roof encouraged healthy development and when the changing seasons asked for greater patience. Their understanding grew slowly, one harvest after another, shaped by experience gathered across many lifetimes. Much of that knowledge became family tradition, passed from parents to children through years of shared work rather than formal lessons. One remarkable aspect of this stage is how little direct intervention takes place. Once the conditions are right, there is often wisdom in allowing nature to proceed without unnecessary interference. This idea may feel unfamiliar today because we are accustomed to adjusting, improving, and optimizing almost everything around us. Yet experienced producers understand that constantly interrupting a natural process often achieves the opposite of what was intended. Sometimes the greatest skill lies in recognizing when to step back and allow nature to continue uninterrupted. Looking at the liquid today, an impatient observer might still wonder why anyone would continue waiting. It already resembles vinegar in many respects, and many modern products would likely be bottled at this stage. Yet the families of Modena have always understood that the true character of traditional balsamic vinegar has barely begun to emerge. Nature has opened the first pages of a much longer story, one that will unfold inside carefully chosen wooden barrels, where air, wood, changing seasons, and the quiet passage of time will continue shaping every precious drop. The next stage of this remarkable process takes us upward rather than downward. Many listeners naturally imagine valuable foods being stored in cool underground cellars where temperatures remain steady throughout the year. Wine often rests beneath thick stone walls, protected from sudden changes in weather. Traditional balsamic vinegar follows a completely different path. Instead of seeking constant conditions, it embraces change. Families carry their precious barrels into attic spaces known as acetae, where every season is welcomed rather than avoided. It is here, beneath the rooftops of Modena, that nature becomes one of the most important partners in the entire process. An acetea is far more than a storage room. It is a carefully chosen environment where the rhythm of the seasons can work without interruption. During the height of summer, temperatures beneath the roof rise well above those found inside the living areas below. Winter brings an entirely different character as cool air settles across the attic and the pace of change becomes noticeably slower. Unlike modern food production, where climate-controlled buildings strive to eliminate every fluctuation, traditional balsamic vinegar depends upon those very differences. What might seem like an inconvenience elsewhere becomes an essential ingredient here. Imagine hanging freshly washed clothes outside on a warm summer afternoon. Within a few hours they become dry because warmth encourages moisture to leave the fabric and drift into the surrounding air. The same simple principle quietly takes place inside the wooden barrels resting in the attic. Summer warmth encourages a small amount of water to evaporate through the wood. It happens so gradually that no one standing nearby would ever notice it from 1 hour to the next. Yet across an entire season, that gentle evaporation slowly concentrates the liquid, making every remaining drop richer than before. When autumn arrives, the air begins to cool, and the pace of evaporation naturally eases. By the time winter settles across northern Italy, everything slows even further. The vinegar is never frozen, nor does the process come to a complete stop. Instead, nature simply changes its rhythm. The liquid rests through the colder months, allowing countless tiny reactions to continue at their own measured pace before warmer days return once again. Rather than seeing winter as lost time, experienced producers understand it is simply another part of the annual cycle. Walking into an acetea during midsummer feels very different from visiting the same room in the middle of winter. During the warmer months, the attic carries the heat gathered beneath the roof throughout the day. The scent of aging vinegar mingles with the aroma of old timber, creating an atmosphere unlike anywhere else. In winter, the air feels crisp and refreshing, and the room settles into a slower rhythm. The barrels experience both extremes year after year, quietly responding without complaint, just as they have for generations. Families who have cared for these attic lofts across many generations often speak of the seasons almost as trusted companions. They know how the warmth of July influences the barrels. They recognize the arrival of cooler autumn evenings. They understand that each passing year repeats a familiar pattern while still bringing its own subtle differences. No two summers are exactly alike. No two winters follow precisely the same path. Those small variations become part of the personality of every vintage, giving each year's production its own quiet identity. Visitors are often surprised by how simple these attic spaces appear. There are no elaborate decorations announcing the importance of what rests inside. Rows of barrels sit beneath aging roof beams, arranged with care but without unnecessary display. The value lies not in grand architecture, but in what time has quietly accomplished within the wood. Looking across the collection, it becomes easy to forget that each barrel represents years, and sometimes decades, of patient craftsmanship. Inside every acetea, the seasons continue their endless conversation with the barrels. Summer gently concentrates the liquid. Winter encourages a period of slower transformation. Spring and autumn quietly guide the transition between the two. Year after year, those familiar cycles repeat with extraordinary consistency, asking for nothing more than time and thoughtful stewardship. It is here, beneath the rooftops of Modena, that nature truly becomes part of the recipe, proving once again that some of the finest ingredients cannot be harvested, measured, or purchased. They arrive with the changing seasons, one ordinary year after another, quietly shaping every precious drop of traditional balsamic vinegar. A visitor looking across the attic for the first time may notice something rather curious about the arrangement of the barrels. They are not all the same size. Instead, they stand in carefully organized rows, that begin with the largest cask and gradually become smaller and smaller until the final barrel is only a fraction of the size of the first. At first glance, it may seem like nothing more than a practical way to organize the collection. In reality, this arrangement forms one of the most ingenious systems in the entire craft of traditional balsamic vinegar. Every barrel has a purpose, every transfer follows a carefully established pattern, and every decision reflects centuries of thoughtful experience. These collections of barrels are known as batteries. The name may sound surprising, because today the word usually brings to mind something that powers a torch or a mobile telephone. In the world of traditional balsamic vinegar, however, a battery refers to a family of wooden casks arranged in a precise order. Each barrel is slightly smaller than the one before it, creating a gradual progression that allows the vinegar to continue its long and patient development year after year. Imagine a relay race where each runner carefully hands the baton to the next person waiting farther along the track. Every participant has an important role, yet none completes the race alone. The barrel battery works in a similar fashion. Instead of the vinegar remaining in one large container throughout its entire life, it slowly moves through a sequence of smaller barrels, each one contributing something unique, before passing the liquid onward. The journey is never hurried, and each transfer represents another important step in the long process of maturation. The largest barrel always begins the cycle. Freshly prepared grape must enter this cask after completing the earlier stages of its transformation. There is plenty of room inside, allowing the liquid to begin its gradual relationship with the wood and the changing seasons. Nothing dramatic happens during the first months. The vinegar simply begins adapting to its new home, while nature quietly continues the work already set in motion. As the years pass, a small amount of vinegar is carefully transferred into the next barrel, which is slightly smaller. That second barrel is never emptied before receiving the new addition. Instead, it already contains older vinegar from previous years. The younger liquid blends with the more mature vinegar already waiting inside, allowing experience and youth to meet in a way that resembles wisdom being shared from one generation to another. This gradual blending has remained one of the defining characteristics of traditional balsamic vinegar for centuries. The process continues from barrel to barrel, always moving from larger casks into slightly smaller ones. Every transfer is surprisingly modest. There is no dramatic pouring of entire barrels. Only a carefully measured amount is moved each year, allowing the majority of the vinegar to remain where it is. This restraint reflects the entire philosophy of traditional balsamic vinegar. Nothing is rushed simply because it could be. Every movement is deliberate, patient, and guided by experience gathered over countless harvests. One fascinating aspect of this system is that no barrel is ever completely emptied. Even when vinegar is transferred to the next cask, a generous portion always remains behind. That remaining liquid becomes the foundation for the following year, welcoming another small addition when the time arrives. In this way, every barrel contains traces of many different harvests, each contributing its own character to the finished vinegar. As the vinegar gradually moves through the battery, the barrels themselves become smaller, for a very practical reason. Each year, a little moisture naturally evaporates through the wood. As the volume slowly decreases, there is less liquid to hold. Moving the vinegar into progressively smaller casks keeps the barrel comfortably filled while allowing the aging process to continue under ideal conditions. The arrangement is wonderfully simple, yet brilliantly effective, making full use of nature rather than struggling against it. Every barrel also develops its own individual personality over the years. Although they all perform the same general task, no two casks behave in precisely the same way. Each has absorbed countless seasons of warmth and cold. Each has held vinegar from many different harvests. Each has slowly developed characteristics that experienced master distillers come to recognize almost as though they were greeting familiar old friends. Knowing the personality of every barrel becomes part of the family's inherited knowledge, quietly passed from one generation to the next. At the very end of the battery rests the smallest barrel of all. Although modest in size, it contains the oldest and most mature vinegar in the entire collection. Every year, only a very small amount is carefully removed for bottling. The quantity is intentionally limited because replacing it too quickly would disturb the balance that has taken decades to achieve. Once that precious amount has been withdrawn, the smallest barrel receives a careful addition from the next largest cask. That barrel is then replenished from the one before it, and so the sequence continues all the way back through the battery until fresh cooked grape must finally enters the largest barrel once again. One fascinating discovery awaiting anyone who studies traditional balsamic vinegar is that the barrels do far more than simply hold the liquid while it ages. Each cask quietly becomes an active participant in the process, contributing its own subtle character over many years. A visitor might glance across a row of barrels and see only different pieces of wood, yet experienced master distillers see something entirely different. They see individual personalities. Every type of wood leaves behind a gentle fingerprint that slowly becomes woven into the finished vinegar. None overwhelms the others. Instead, each contributes its own small voice to a conversation that has been unfolding for decades. Imagine listening to a string quartet. A violin, a viola, a cello, and a double bass all produce very different sounds, yet none tries to dominate the performance. Together they create something richer than any single instrument could achieve alone. The barrel battery works in much the same way. As the vinegar gradually moves through the collection, each type of wood contributes a delicate note that becomes part of the finished harmony. The influence is never sudden or dramatic. It develops patiently, almost unnoticed, until years later, the finished vinegar possesses a depth that could never have come from a single barrel alone. Among the most familiar woods used by master distillers is oak. Across Europe, oak has earned an enduring reputation for its strength, stability, and remarkable ability to mature fine foods and beverages. Wine producers have trusted oak barrels for centuries, and the makers of traditional balsamic vinegar have done the same. Oak contributes gentle notes that many people describe as warm and rounded, often carrying subtle hints that remind people of vanilla or toasted wood. These qualities do not leap from the vinegar with obvious intensity. Instead, they quietly support the overall balance, becoming part of a flavor that feels complete rather than easily separated into individual parts. Chestnut wood offers a noticeably different contribution. It contains naturally occurring tannins, compounds that also play an important role in tea, red wine, and many fruits. These tannins gently influence the structure of the vinegar, adding another layer of complexity that slowly develops during the aging process. Much like a skilled architect strengthening a building without changing its appearance, chestnut quietly reinforces the character of the vinegar without demanding attention for itself. Its influence becomes part of the foundation rather than the decoration. Cherrywood introduces another subtle dimension. As the years pass, barrels made from cherry are often said to encourage a softer, slightly sweeter character. This does not mean the vinegar suddenly tastes like cherries. Rather, the wood contributes an elegant roundness that complements the natural richness already developing through years of aging. Many master distillers value cherry because it helps soften the sharper edges that younger vinegar may still possess, allowing the finished product to feel beautifully balanced. Mulberry wood performs a task unlike any of the others. While every barrel allows a small amount of evaporation through its tiny pores, mulberry encourages this process a little more readily. That gradual loss of moisture helps concentrate the vinegar, allowing flavors to become richer as the years pass. Once again, the effect is wonderfully patient. No dramatic reduction takes place over a single season. Instead, year after year, the vinegar slowly becomes denser and more luxurious, almost as though the passing decades are gently polishing every drop. Juniper provides perhaps the most distinctive character of all the traditional woods. Its influence is wonderfully aromatic, contributing delicate notes that many people find difficult to describe with complete precision. Some sense gentle hints of evergreen forests. Others notice subtle touches that seem almost spicy or resinous. Whatever words are chosen, everyone agrees that juniper contributes another layer of remarkable complexity, enriching the finished vinegar without disturbing its careful balance. Choosing how these different woods work together requires years of experience. A master distiller does not simply gather barrels at random. Every battery reflects thoughtful decisions shaped by generations of careful observation. Families have learned which combinations produce the finest results, passing that knowledge from parents to children through decades of shared work. Although modern science can explain many aspects of wood chemistry, there remains an element of craftsmanship that can only be understood through long experience. Ashwood is another member of this remarkable family of barrel woods, although it appears less frequently than oak, chestnut, cherry, mulberry, or juniper. Even so, its presence reminds us that master distillers have never been limited to a single approach. Over many centuries, families experimented, observed, and gradually discovered how different woods shape the vinegar in subtle yet meaningful ways. Every barrel became another lesson, and every generation added a little more understanding to knowledge that had already been developing for hundreds of years. Ash is often appreciated for the gentle way it interacts with the vinegar. Rather than making a bold statement, it offers a quiet contribution that blends naturally with the influence of the other woods in the battery. Much like a supporting musician in an orchestra, its role is not to stand alone, but to strengthen the overall performance. The finished vinegar rarely reflects one particular barrel. Instead, it becomes the result of many different influences working together over an extraordinary length of time. Imagine preparing the same cup of tea using 5 different kinds of water collected from different mountain springs. The tea leaves remain exactly the same, Yet subtle differences begin to appear because each spring carries its own minerals and character. The changes may not be dramatic enough for everyone to notice immediately, but together they shape the final experience. The barrels of an acetия behave in a remarkably similar way. The vinegar remains the same at its heart, while each type of wood gently guides its development in a slightly different direction. The more one studies traditional balsamic vinegar, the clearer it becomes that this is a craft built upon observation rather than rigid formulas. There is no universal instruction book capable of replacing years of experience. A family may inherit a battery that has matured beneath the same roof for generations, and with it, they inherit countless small observations gathered by parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents. They learn how each barrel behaves during particularly warm summers. They recognize which casks respond differently after damp winters. They notice tiny changes that might pass completely unnoticed by someone seeing the collection for the first time. That accumulated knowledge becomes one of the most valuable possessions a family can own. Unlike a machine that performs exactly the same task every day, living materials continue changing throughout their lives. Wood expands and contracts with the seasons. It slowly ages alongside the vinegar it contains. Even barrels made from the same species of tree may develop slightly different personalities after many decades of use. Recognizing those differences requires more than technical knowledge. It requires familiarity built through years of careful attention. This is where the master distiller truly earns that title. The work is not simply about moving vinegar from one barrel to another according to a calendar. It is about understanding a living process that never repeats itself in exactly the same way twice. Every harvest begins under slightly different weather conditions. Every summer brings its own pattern of warmth. Every winter leaves its own subtle influence. The master distiller observes these changing conditions and responds with patience rather than haste. Families often describe themselves not as owners of the vinegar, but as caretakers of a tradition. That distinction reveals something important about their way of thinking. Ownership suggests complete control, while stewardship recognizes responsibility. The barrels have existed before the current generation, and with good care, they will continue serving those who come after. The role of today's master distiller is therefore not to reinvent the process, but to preserve and strengthen it for the future. That sense of responsibility has encouraged many families to protect their methods with great care. Throughout history, knowledge surrounding traditional balsamic vinegar was often shared only within the family itself. Recipes, observations, and practical experience were passed from one generation to the next through years of working side by side. Children grew up watching older relatives tend the barrels, gradually absorbing lessons that were rarely written down. By the time they accepted responsibility themselves, much of the knowledge had become second nature. This tradition of careful guardianship explains why every family's vinegar developed its own subtle identity. Two neighboring households might use similar grape varieties, similar barrels, and similar techniques, yet the finished vinegars would never be completely identical. Tiny differences accumulated over decades, shaped by experience, personal judgment, and the unique character of each barrel battery. Rather than seeking perfect uniformity, families took pride in preserving those individual characteristics. Looking across the rows of aging barrels, it becomes clear that the master distiller performs a role that combines science, craftsmanship, history, and patience in equal measure. Every decision respects lessons learned by earlier generations while preparing the vinegar for those yet to come. The barrels continue their quiet work, the seasons continue their familiar rhythm, and the traditions of Modena remain alive because families have chosen to become faithful caretakers rather than impatient innovators. Some of the barrels resting inside the attic vinegar lofts of Modena are older than anyone currently caring for them. In fact, a few have already celebrated their 100th birthday and continue serving the very purpose for which they were originally built. It is an astonishing thought. A barrel crafted at the beginning of the 20th century may still be quietly shaping traditional balsamic vinegar today, having witnessed world wars, changing governments, remarkable inventions, and generations of families growing up beneath the same roof. While the world outside transformed at an extraordinary pace, these wooden casks continued performing the same patient task they had always known. When people hear that a barrel is more than 100 years old, they often imagine something fragile or worn beyond usefulness. The reality is quite different. A well-cared-for barrel does not become less valuable with age. Quite the opposite. Every passing decade deepens its connection to the vinegar it protects. The wood slowly becomes seasoned by countless years of contact with the liquid, developing characteristics that simply cannot be recreated in a newly built cask. Time leaves its mark not only on the vinegar, but also on the barrel itself. Looking closely at one of these venerable casks reveals a surface unlike freshly cut timber. Decades of changing temperatures, gentle evaporation, and careful handling gradually darken the wood. Rich shades of deep brown replace the lighter colors the barrel once displayed in its youth. Tiny marks collected over many years hint at countless harvests, careful inspections, and patient hands lifting lids or making small adjustments. Nothing about the appearance feels polished for display. Instead, it reflects a lifetime of quiet service. The wood itself also changes internally. Although a barrel appears solid, it is actually made from countless tiny fibers that once carried water and nutrients through a living tree. Even after becoming carefully crafted staves, those microscopic pathways continue giving the wood one of its most remarkable qualities. They allow the barrel to breathe. That word may sound unusual when describing a piece of wood, yet it captures the process beautifully. The barrel does not breathe in the same way people or animals do, but its tiny pores allow an incredibly gentle exchange between the vinegar and the surrounding air. The openings are far too small to see without magnification, yet they perform one of the most important roles in the entire aging process. Imagine leaving a bowl of fresh fruit on a kitchen table for several days. As moisture slowly leaves the fruit, the flavors become more concentrated. Grapes naturally become sweeter when they are dried into raisins because much of their water has gradually disappeared while the natural sugars remain behind. Something remarkably similar takes place inside the aging barrels. Year after year, tiny amounts of water leave through the wood while the valuable flavor compounds remain inside, becoming increasingly concentrated. This slow reduction in volume explains why authentic traditional balsamic vinegar is produced in such limited quantities. The barrels are never magically refilled by nature. As moisture escapes through the wood, the amount of vinegar gradually becomes smaller. Each passing year leaves a little less liquid than the year before, yet what remains becomes increasingly precious. Quantity slowly decreases, while quality steadily increases. Master distillers understand this relationship instinctively. They never view evaporation as a problem to eliminate. Instead, they recognize it as one of nature's most valuable contributions. Without that steady concentration, the vinegar could never develop the richness, balance, and remarkable depth that have made it famous throughout the world. Every drop lost to the passing seasons helps improve every drop that remains. Looking across these century-old casks, one cannot help but admire the extraordinary partnership between nature and craftsmanship. A living tree became carefully seasoned timber. Skilled coopers transformed that timber into barrels. Families protected those barrels through generations of careful stewardship. The changing seasons quietly performed their work, while the wood itself slowly concentrated every precious drop resting inside. Together, they created something that could never have been achieved by any single part alone. Year after year, the barrels continue their patient work, quietly giving up a little of their contents to the surrounding air. Every summer encourages another small amount of moisture to drift through the pores of the wood, while every winter allows the vinegar to settle into a slower rhythm before the cycle begins again. The change is so gradual that it can easily escape notice, yet over many decades, the difference becomes astonishing. A barrel that once held a generous amount of liquid may eventually contain only a fraction of its original volume, not because anyone has removed it, but because nature has carefully claimed its own small share. Among winemakers and spirit makers, there is a beautiful expression for this gradual loss. They call it the angel's share. The phrase suggests that the tiny amount disappearing into the air each year has been quietly carried away by unseen visitors. No one expects angels to literally collect the vapor, of course, yet the expression captures something important about the process. It reminds us that not everything disappearing is being wasted. In fact, what leaves behind allows what remains to become even more valuable. The first time someone hears about the angel's share, they often imagine a dramatic amount vanishing each year. The reality is wonderfully modest. Only a very small percentage escapes through the wood during each season. If you were to compare the level inside a barrel from one month to the next, the difference would hardly attract attention. Yet traditional balsamic vinegar has never depended upon dramatic change. Its entire story is built upon countless tiny changes that quietly accumulate over extraordinary lengths of time. As moisture slowly leaves the barrel, the remaining vinegar becomes denser. Natural sugars, acids, aromas, and flavor compounds are gently concentrated year after year. Nothing artificial is added to create this richness. It develops naturally because the balance between liquid and flavor steadily changes with the passing seasons. The vinegar does not simply become older. It becomes deeper, fuller, and increasingly complex in ways that younger vinegar cannot imitate. This gradual concentration explains why authentic traditional balsamic vinegar develops its distinctive texture. Many listeners encountering it for the first time are surprised by how smoothly it flows. Rather than pouring quickly like water, it moves with graceful confidence, forming slow droplets that cling gently to a spoon before falling. That luxurious consistency is not the result of added thickeners or special processing. It is simply the reward earned through many years of patient evaporation. As the years pass, another remarkable reality begins to emerge. A large barrel that once seemed capable of filling countless bottles slowly produces less and less finished vinegar. Visitors often find this difficult to imagine. Looking at the size of the largest casks, it seems reasonable to expect hundreds of bottles waiting to be filled every year. The truth is very different. By the time the vinegar has traveled through the entire battery and reached full maturity, only a surprisingly small amount is ready to leave the smallest barrel. That fact often changes the way people think about the value of authentic traditional balsamic vinegar. At first glance, the small bottles may seem surprisingly expensive compared with ordinary supermarket vinegar. Yet once someone understands the extraordinary amount of time, care, evaporation and craftsmanship contained within every drop, the price begins to tell a different story. The bottle is not simply holding vinegar, it is holding decades. Every harvest, therefore, becomes an investment in the future rather than an immediate source of reward. The grape must prepared this autumn will not become next year's finished product. Instead, it begins a journey that may continue for decades before reaching the smallest barrel in the battery. Some of the people caring for it today know they may never taste its final form. They continue anyway, because a tradition has always been larger than any single lifetime. When a bottle is finally filled, it represents far more than the contents resting inside the glass. It reflects years of changing seasons beneath attic roofs, countless hours of thoughtful observation, the slow concentration brought about by evaporation, and the extraordinary patience required to wait while nature completed its work. Every bottle is remarkably small, yet the story it contains is immense. For many people, the first surprise comes when they finally see a bottle of authentic traditional balsamic vinegar. After hearing about decades of careful aging, rows of wooden barrels, and generations of patient craftsmanship, they often expect an impressive bottle holding several hundred milliliters. Instead, they are handed something that fits comfortably in the palm of the hand. At first glance, it almost seems too small. Then, they begin to understand why. When a process depends upon years of evaporation, careful transfers between barrels, and the willingness to bottle only tiny amounts each year, abundance is simply not part of the story. The modest size of the bottle is not an attempt to create exclusivity. It reflects reality. Every drop represents an extraordinary investment of time, and the quantity available at the end of the aging process is naturally limited. Rather than stretching the supply by lowering standards, the producers of traditional balsamic vinegar have always preferred to protect quality, even if that means filling only a small number of bottles each year. The official bottle used for traditional balsamic vinegar from Modena holds 100 milliliters. Compared with many bottles found in supermarkets, it appears almost miniature. Yet those 100 milliliters contain far more than liquid. They contain years of changing seasons, careful observation, patient craftsmanship, and the quiet work of nature itself. Every bottle represents a journey that began many years earlier with freshly harvested grapes and slowly unfolded beneath the rooftops of an attic vinegar loft. Because authentic traditional balsamic vinegar has earned such a respected reputation, protecting its identity has become increasingly important. As its popularity spread beyond Italy, many products began appearing on shop shelves using similar names despite following very different methods of production. Some were perfectly enjoyable vinegars in their own right, yet they were not traditional balsamic vinegar in the historic sense developed over centuries in Modena. Without clear standards, it would have become increasingly difficult for buyers to understand the difference. Italy responded by establishing strict regulations that protect the traditional methods passed down through generations. These rules help ensure that when someone purchases authentic traditional balsamic vinegar, they receive a product created according to the same fundamental principles that have defined the craft for centuries. The regulations do not exist to make life difficult for producers. Instead, they preserve trust between those who create the vinegar and those who appreciate it. Certification, therefore, becomes an important part of the story. Before authentic traditional balsamic vinegar reaches the marketplace, it must satisfy carefully defined standards. These standards examine far more than appearance alone. They ensure the vinegar has been produced according to traditional methods, has matured for the required length of time, and reflects the quality expected from one of Italy's most treasured culinary traditions. Only then is it permitted to carry the protected designation that distinguishes it from countless other vinegars available around the world. One of the most important pieces of information found on the label concerns the age of the vinegar. Authentic traditional balsamic vinegar cannot simply be bottled whenever someone decides it looks ready. Time itself establishes the earliest moment when bottling becomes possible. The minimum aging requirement is 12 years. That figure alone is remarkable when compared with most foods found in a typical kitchen. 12 years represents a significant portion of a person's life, yet within the world of traditional balsamic vinegar, it marks only the beginning of maturity. Some vinegars continue aging for 25 years or even longer. During those additional years, the liquid continues becoming richer, smoother, and more concentrated. Every passing season contributes another subtle layer of complexity, allowing the vinegar to develop a remarkable balance that younger examples have not yet had time to achieve. Just as an experienced storyteller often gains greater depth through the passing decades, the vinegar quietly gathers character that cannot be hurried into existence. Remember that the labels do not merely describe age for the sake of curiosity. They help buyers understand the journey each bottle has completed before arriving in their hands. A bottle labeled as having matured for at least 12 years has already experienced more than a decade of careful stewardship. One that has rested for 25 years has witnessed an even greater passage of time beneath the changing seasons of Modena. Those years become part of the value because they can never be compressed or recreated. The passage of 12 years is a remarkable span of time by almost any measure. A child entering primary school will have grown into a young adult. A newly planted orchard will have matured and begun producing dependable harvests. Entire neighborhoods can change, businesses may open and close, and countless ordinary moments quietly become memories. Yet within the attic vinegar lofts of Modena, 12 years represents only the earliest point at which traditional balsamic vinegar may be considered ready to leave the barrel. For the families who have cared for these collections across generations, that first milestone is not the finish line. It is simply the beginning of true maturity. When people first hear about the 12-year minimum, they often pause in disbelief, It is difficult to imagine waiting that long for any food, especially in a world where so much is designed to be consumed immediately. Even fine cheeses and carefully cured meats generally require months or perhaps a few years before reaching their best. Traditional balsamic vinegar belongs to an entirely different category. It follows its own patient calendar, one measured not in weeks or months but in decades. Reaching the 12-year mark is therefore a significant achievement. By this stage, the vinegar has traveled through the barrel battery, experienced countless seasonal changes, and slowly developed a harmony between sweetness and acidity that younger vinegar has not yet achieved. The sharp edges of youth have softened. The flavors have become more closely woven together. Rather than tasting like individual parts, the vinegar begins presenting itself as one beautifully balanced whole. For some families, however, 12 years is only where the most fascinating chapter begins. Instead of preparing the vinegar for bottling, they simply allow it to remain inside the barrels for many more years. 25 years is another important milestone within the tradition, and many treasured examples continue aging even longer. During those additional years, time continues performing its quiet work without asking for praise or recognition. The vinegar simply grows deeper, richer, and increasingly refined. One of the first changes people notice in older vinegar is its texture. Young balsamic vinegar flows freely, much like many other liquids found in the kitchen. A vinegar that has matured for decades behaves quite differently. It pours slowly, forming smooth, graceful drops that seem almost reluctant to leave the bottle. Watching it fall onto a piece of Parmigiano Reggiano or a fresh strawberry can be surprisingly satisfying, because every movement reflects the extraordinary concentration achieved through years of patient evaporation. Many first-time visitors assume that this luxurious texture must come from adding something during production. Perhaps they imagine a natural thickener or a carefully guarded ingredient known only to a few families. The truth is far simpler, and in many ways, far more remarkable. Nothing has been added to create that consistency. It is simply the natural result of allowing water to disappear gradually through the pores of the wood, while everything valuable remains behind. Time alone has performed the transformation. Color also changes in beautiful ways throughout the aging process. Fresh grape musk begins with warm tones that reflect the fruit from which it came. As the years quietly pass, those colors deepen into rich shades of brown, so dark they often appear almost black beneath gentle light. Holding a small amount in a tasting spoon reveals subtle hints of ruby and mahogany when sunlight catches the surface. The appearance reflects the same patient evolution taking place within the flavor itself. Perhaps the greatest transformation of all takes place in the aroma. Before the vinegar even reaches the tongue, it begins telling its story through fragrance. A younger vinegar may offer pleasant notes of fresh fruit and lively acidity. One that has matured for many decades presents something altogether more intricate. Sweetness, wood, fruit, gentle spice, and delicate acidity become woven together so completely that identifying individual aromas becomes almost impossible. Rather than competing for attention, they greet the senses together as one harmonious expression. Professional tasters often spend years developing the ability to recognize these delicate layers. Their role is not simply to decide whether a vinegar tastes pleasant. Instead, they evaluate how successfully sweetness, acidity, aroma, texture and finish have come together through the aging process. They understand that greatness rarely announces itself with overwhelming intensity. More often, it reveals itself through balance, elegance, and the effortless way every characteristic supports the others. Standing before a tasting table, many people naturally expect the experience to resemble sampling wine or perhaps olive oil. They imagine generous pours into small glasses, careful swirling, and several mouthfuls before reaching a conclusion. Traditional balsamic vinegar follows a very different tradition. The quantities are remarkably small, often no more than a few precious drops resting inside a white ceramic tasting spoon. At first glance, the serving almost seems too modest to tell much of a story. Yet those few drops contain years, and sometimes decades, of patient craftsmanship. Within that tiny portion lies everything the master distiller has worked to preserve. Professional tasting begins long before the vinegar reaches the tongue. The very first impression comes from sight. A small spoon is gently tilted beneath the light, allowing the vinegar to reveal its color and consistency. Years of careful aging become visible almost immediately. The liquid moves slowly across the smooth surface, forming graceful curves rather than rushing from one side to the other. Its deep brown color often catches subtle flashes of ruby when the light strikes at just the right angle. Even before a single aroma has been noticed, the vinegar is already offering clues about the years it has spent resting inside the barrel battery. Only after that first visual impression does the attention turn to aroma. The spoon is raised gently, never hurried, allowing the fragrance to reveal itself naturally. There is no need for vigorous swirling or exaggerated movements. The aromas have spent decades developing. They require no encouragement. Instead, they rise softly from the spoon, inviting careful observation rather than dramatic reaction. A beautifully matured traditional balsamic vinegar rarely presents a single dominant fragrance. Instead, it unfolds gradually. Sweet notes from the grapes mingle with delicate hints left behind by the various woods of the barrel battery. Gentle acidity adds freshness without becoming sharp, while years of slow concentration have woven every element together so completely that separating one from another becomes almost impossible. Rather than noticing individual parts, the taster experiences harmony. After appreciating the aroma, the smallest possible amount is placed on the tongue. It is surprising how little is needed. Just a single drop can be enough to reveal the extraordinary balance that has taken decades to achieve. There is no reason to rush. In fact, the finest vinegars almost encourage the taster to pause for a moment before swallowing, allowing every flavor to unfold at its own natural pace. One of the most important qualities experts evaluate is balance. This single word carries enormous meaning within the world of traditional balsamic vinegar. Sweetness and acidity must exist together in perfect harmony. If the sweetness dominates completely, the vinegar loses its refreshing character. If acidity becomes too strong, the delicate richness developed over many years is overshadowed. Neither quality should compete for attention. Instead, they should support one another with effortless grace. Texture forms another important part of the evaluation. Earlier in the journey, the vinegar gradually became thicker through years of natural evaporation. Now that texture reveals itself fully. The liquid should feel smooth and silky, coating the tongue gently before disappearing. There should never be any sense of heaviness or stickiness. Instead, the richness feels graceful, almost elegant, reminding the taster that concentration alone is never enough. Refinement matters just as much. As the vinegar is swallowed, another stage of the tasting quietly begins. The flavor does not disappear immediately. Instead, it lingers gently, allowing the various characteristics to reveal themselves one after another. This lingering impression is often called the finish, and among experienced tasters, it provides another valuable clue about the quality of the vinegar. A beautifully matured example leaves behind a pleasant memory that continues for several moments without becoming overpowering. Perhaps one of the greatest surprises for people tasting authentic traditional balsamic vinegar for the first time is discovering how little is actually needed. Modern cooking often encourages generous portions, yet traditional balsamic vinegar follows an entirely different philosophy. Because the flavors have become so beautifully concentrated, only a few drops are required to transform a dish completely. After spending years learning how traditional balsamic vinegar is made, it becomes almost impossible to look at it as an ordinary condiment. Every drop carries the patient work of nature, the careful judgment of master distillers, and the quiet dedication of generations who understood that some things simply cannot be hurried. Perhaps that is why serving authentic traditional balsamic vinegar has always been approached with remarkable restraint. Unlike sauces that are poured generously across an entire meal, this treasured vinegar is used sparingly, almost as though each drop deserves its own moment of appreciation. The first time someone watches an experienced chef use authentic traditional balsamic vinegar, they are often surprised by how little leaves the bottle. There is no dramatic splash covering the plate. Instead, only a few carefully placed drops rest upon the food. To someone unfamiliar with its extraordinary concentration, the serving may even seem incomplete. Yet the opposite is true. The vinegar has already spent decades becoming more expressive, allowing even the smallest amount to transform the entire dish without overwhelming it. One of the most celebrated companions to traditional balsamic vinegar is Parmigiano Reggiano. It seems only fitting that two of Emilia-Romagna's greatest culinary treasures should come together on the same plate. Both depend upon years of patient aging. Both have earned international admiration without abandoning the traditional methods that made them famous. Together, they create a partnership that feels almost inevitable, as though they have been waiting centuries to meet. A small piece of well-aged Parmigiano Reggiano already possesses remarkable depth on its own. Tiny crystals formed during the aging process create a pleasant texture, while the flavor carries gentle notes of milk, roasted nuts, and long maturation. Then a single drop of traditional balsamic vinegar is added. Almost immediately, the experience changes. The vinegar does not hide the cheese beneath sweetness or acidity. Instead, it gently awakens flavors that were already waiting to be discovered. Each bite becomes richer, more rounded, and wonderfully balanced. Another pairing often surprises first-time visitors to Modena. Fresh strawberries and traditional balsamic vinegar may sound like an unusual combination at first, yet together they create one of the most admired desserts in Italian cuisine. The sweetness of perfectly ripe strawberries is gently lifted by the balanced acidity of the vinegar, while the concentrated fruit notes developed during decades of aging seem to echo the natural character of the berries themselves. Many listeners assume vinegar must always taste sharp or overpowering. Authentic traditional balsamic vinegar quickly challenges that expectation. Because sweetness and acidity have spent so many years reaching harmony, the vinegar enhances the strawberries rather than masking them. The fruit becomes brighter, the aroma more expressive, and every mouthful feels somehow more complete than either ingredient could achieve alone. Risotto offers another wonderful example of this quiet partnership. A beautifully prepared risotto already depends upon patience. Rice is stirred gradually, while warm stock is added little by little, allowing every grain to absorb flavor before receiving the next addition. The process cannot be rushed without sacrificing the creamy texture that defines the dish. In many ways, preparing risotto asks for the same thoughtful pace as aging traditional balsamic vinegar. When the risotto is finally finished, only a few drops of aged vinegar are needed. The rich creaminess of the rice provides a gentle foundation, while the vinegar introduces brightness and remarkable depth. Rather than becoming the main flavor, it quietly ties everything together, encouraging each ingredient to complement the others. Once again, restraint becomes the secret to success. Perhaps one of the most unexpected pairings of all involves gelato. At first, the idea of placing vinegar onto frozen dessert sounds almost impossible to imagine. Many listeners hesitate before trying it for the first time. Then comes the first spoonful, followed almost immediately by surprise. The cool creaminess of the gelato and the rich concentration of the vinegar create a balance that feels both familiar and completely unexpected. Vanilla gelato is especially admired because its gentle flavor allows the vinegar to reveal its remarkable complexity without overwhelming the dessert. Sweetness meets sweetness, while the delicate acidity prevents the combination from becoming too rich. The result feels wonderfully balanced, proving once again that traditional balsamic vinegar refuses to fit neatly into ordinary expectations. Long before traditional balsamic vinegar earned international admiration, it was already regarded as one of the most treasured possessions a family could own. During the Middle Ages, noble households throughout the region of Modena looked upon their barrel batteries with enormous pride. These carefully tended collections represented far more than food. They reflected patience, prosperity, family heritage, and the ability to think beyond the present moment. While gold and silver displayed wealth that could be counted, a well-established battery of aging vinegar demonstrated something far more difficult to acquire. It showed that a family had invested years, often generations, into preserving a tradition that no amount of money alone could instantly create. Historical records from medieval Italy describe balsamic vinegar as a precious gift, reserved for people held in especially high regard. Unlike ordinary foods that appeared at every meal, this remarkable vinegar was treated with respect and presented only on meaningful occasions. A small amount carried tremendous significance because everyone understood the extraordinary commitment required to produce it. Offering such a gift was not simply an act of generosity, it was a gesture of honor. Among the most meaningful occasions for presenting traditional balsamic vinegar was a wedding. Marriage has always represented more than the joining of two individuals. It also brings together families, traditions, and hopes for the future. In Modena, one of the most thoughtful wedding gifts a family could offer was a battery of aging barrels. Rather than presenting something that would be enjoyed immediately, they gave a gift that would continue growing in value throughout the couple's lives together. There is something deeply touching about that tradition. Imagine beginning married life with a collection of barrels already carrying years of careful aging. As the couple built their home, raised children, and celebrated life's milestones, the vinegar quietly continued its own journey above them, beneath the attic roof. Every anniversary marked another year in the marriage and another year in the life of the barrel battery. The passage of time strengthened both together, creating a beautiful parallel between family life and the patient craft unfolding inside the casks. For many generations, these barrel collections became an important part of a bride's dowry. Today, the word dowry may sound unfamiliar or belong to another era, yet throughout much of history, it referred to the property or valuable possessions a bride brought into her new household. In Modena, a carefully established battery of balsamic vinegar barrels could form one of the most treasured parts of that inheritance. The gift represented stability, continuity, and confidence in the future. More importantly, it reflected a family's willingness to share something that had required decades to develop. Entire families therefore came to view these collections as treasured heirlooms rather than simple household possessions. They were inherited with enormous pride and protected with equal care. Children grew up understanding that the barrels represented the work of parents, grandparents, and ancestors, whose names might no longer be spoken every day, but whose efforts continued living inside every cask. Looking after the battery became both an honor and a responsibility. This sense of continuity gave traditional balsamic vinegar a unique place within family life. Many valuable possessions eventually wear out through regular use. Furniture becomes damaged, clothing fades, buildings require repairs. The barrel battery, however, grew more valuable precisely because it continued fulfilling its purpose. Every passing season added another layer of history rather than reducing its importance. Time did not diminish the inheritance. It enriched it. One can easily imagine an elderly grandparent leading a curious grandchild into the attic for the very first time. Dust floats gently through beams of afternoon sunlight while rows of barrels rest beneath the old roof. The child may initially see nothing more than weathered wood. Then the grandparent begins telling stories. That barrel was cared for by a great-grandfather. Another arrived as part of a wedding many decades earlier. A third has remained in the family for longer than anyone can remember. Suddenly, the collection becomes something far greater than a row of aging casks. It becomes a living family history. These stories helped strengthen the bond between generations. Children learned that they were not simply inheriting property. They were becoming the next caretakers of a tradition that trusted them to continue what others had begun long before they were born. Every careful transfer of vinegar, every inspection of the barrels, and every harvest connected them with relatives whose patient work still shaped the vinegar, resting quietly inside. There is something profoundly reassuring about that outlook. In a world where many things are designed to be replaced after only a few years, the people of Modena have spent centuries caring for possessions intended to serve not one lifetime but many. Their barrel batteries became symbols of continuity, reminding every generation that some of life's most meaningful achievements are measured not by immediate reward, but by the willingness to contribute to something enduring. Looking across those rows of patiently aging barrels, it becomes easy to understand why they were once considered among a family's greatest treasures. They represented love expressed through careful stewardship, hope carried across generations, and the quiet belief that today's efforts could become tomorrow's inheritance. Long after wedding celebrations had ended and countless seasons had passed, the vinegar continued maturing beneath the attic roof, quietly proving that some of the finest gifts are those that grow more valuable with every passing year. For centuries, the knowledge required to produce authentic traditional balsamic vinegar rarely traveled far beyond the city of Modena. It was not taught in universities, published in detailed instruction books, or demonstrated before large audiences. Instead, it lived within families, quietly passed from one generation to the next through years of shared experience. Children learn not by attending formal lessons, but by growing up among the barrels themselves. Long before they were trusted with responsibility, they had already spent countless hours watching older relatives move carefully through the attic, listening to conversations about the harvest, and breathing the familiar aromas that drifted through the aging loft every season. This gradual education began almost without anyone announcing it. A young child might accompany a grandparent into the attic simply out of curiosity. At first there was little to do except observe. The barrels seemed enormous, the room carried an unfamiliar fragrance, and every movement appeared slow and deliberate. Questions naturally followed. Why were the barrels different sizes? Why did some look darker than others? Why did everyone seem to speak more softly while working among them? Each answer became another small lesson, quietly adding to an understanding that would continue growing throughout a lifetime. Unlike many modern professions that rely upon written manuals, the craft of traditional balsamic vinegar depended heavily upon observation. Imagine learning to ride a bicycle by reading a book without ever climbing onto one. The instructions might explain balance, steering, and braking, yet something essential would still be missing. Real understanding comes only through experience. The same has always been true inside the attic vinegar lofts of Modena. A written description can explain the process, but only years spent caring for the barrels teach someone how the craft truly feels. Parents and grandparents therefore became the first teachers. They demonstrated rather than lectured. A child watched how carefully the lids were lifted, how patiently each barrel was inspected, and how thoughtfully every transfer was performed. At first these actions appeared almost ordinary. Only later did the younger generation begin recognizing the extraordinary judgment hidden within each seemingly simple task. Ancient written records provide fascinating glimpses into how highly this vinegar was already regarded many centuries ago. Historians studying documents from medieval Italy have discovered references describing precious vinegars carefully preserved by noble families and respected throughout the region. These records do not always explain every step of production in detail, yet they confirm something very important. The tradition was already well established long before many of Europe's most famous culinary practices had taken their modern form. Consider how much history these records quietly represent. A single handwritten page preserved inside an archive may describe a vinegar that itself required decades to produce. The document survives because someone recognized its value and protected it across countless generations. In much the same way, the vinegar survived because families recognized its importance and continued caring for their barrel batteries year after year. Written history and living tradition quietly supported one another. Although some information eventually found its way into official records, much of the most valuable knowledge remained within individual households. Families naturally developed their own preferences, small refinements, and practical observations gathered through decades of experience. These were not necessarily dramatic secrets hidden behind locked doors. More often, they were countless tiny details that together shaped the character of each family's vinegar. Perhaps one family preferred allowing a particular barrel slightly more time before the annual transfer. Another might recognize subtle differences in how one attic responded to especially warm summers. A grandparent might notice a characteristic aroma that signaled the perfect moment for a particular decision. None of these observations would seem especially important by themselves. Together, however, they formed a body of knowledge that could not easily be duplicated by someone seeing the process for the first time. For many centuries, the craft remained almost entirely local. Families produced vinegar primarily for their own households, for special occasions, or as treasured gifts. Very little reached distant markets because production was naturally limited. There simply was not enough to satisfy widespread demand, nor was there any desire to transform the tradition into large-scale commercial manufacturing. The people of Modena valued quality far more highly than quantity, and their methods reflected that philosophy in every respect. Travelers passing through the region occasionally heard stories about these remarkable vinegars, yet relatively few had the opportunity to taste them. In many ways, traditional balsamic vinegar remained one of Italy's best-kept culinary treasures. It existed quietly beneath the rooftops of ordinary homes, while the outside world carried on largely unaware of the extraordinary patience unfolding inside those attic lofts. That quiet anonymity lasted for centuries. While other foods spread rapidly through expanding trade routes, authentic traditional balsamic vinegar remained closely connected to its birthplace. The tradition became woven into the identity of Modena itself. Visitors did not simply discover a famous product. They encountered a living craft deeply rooted in local history, family life, and the changing rhythm of the surrounding countryside. During the 20th century, however, the wider world gradually began recognizing what the families of Modena had known for generations. As travel became easier and international interest in regional foods continued growing, more people encountered authentic traditional balsamic vinegar for the very first time. Chefs carried stories of its remarkable flavor beyond Italy. Food writers described the extraordinary patience required to create it. Curious travelers returned home eager to share what they had discovered. Growing international recognition brought both opportunity and responsibility. It allowed more people to appreciate one of Italy's greatest culinary traditions, yet it also created new challenges. As demand increased, protecting authenticity became more important than ever. The families who had quietly preserved their methods across generations now faced the task of ensuring that worldwide admiration would never come at the expense of the principles that had made traditional balsamic vinegar so exceptional in the first place. Looking back across nearly 1,000 years of history, it becomes clear that the true strength of this tradition has never rested solely within the barrels themselves. It has always depended upon people willing to learn patiently, teach generously, and preserve knowledge with great care. Every generation inherited more than vinegar. They inherited responsibility. Thanks to their quiet dedication, the same wisdom first shared between parents and children centuries ago continues flowing through the attic vinegar lofts of Modena today, one careful lesson at a time. As authentic traditional balsamic vinegar gradually became known beyond the borders of Italy, it attracted admiration from chefs, travelers, and food lovers who had never experienced anything quite like it. Word spread from one country to another as visitors returned home with stories of tiny bottles containing vinegar that had spent decades aging beneath attic roofs. Restaurants proudly introduced it to curious diners, while culinary writers described its remarkable history and extraordinary patience. Yet growing fame also brought an unexpected challenge. Whenever something becomes highly respected, there is often a temptation for others to imitate it without following the same long and demanding path. Before long, bottles began appearing in shops carrying names and labels that looked reassuringly familiar. Many contained perfectly enjoyable vinegar made for everyday cooking, yet they had very little in common with the centuries-old tradition developed in Modena. Some were produced quickly by blending wine vinegar with concentrated grape products. Others included ingredients designed to imitate the color, sweetness, or thickness that authentic traditional balsamic vinegar acquires only after many years of careful aging. To someone unfamiliar with the tradition, the differences could easily go unnoticed. Imagine traveling to a famous city to see a celebrated historic cathedral, only to discover a modern building nearby, designed to resemble the original from a distance. At first glance, the two might appear similar. Both may have tall towers, beautiful windows, and impressive stonework. Yet one carries centuries of history within its walls, while the other simply borrows its appearance. Authentic traditional balsamic vinegar faced a similar challenge. Many products copied its outward image, but only one continued the genuine tradition that had quietly matured beneath the rooftops of Modena for nearly 1,000 years. This growing confusion threatened more than just the reputation of the vinegar. It also risked diminishing the work of families who had devoted generations to preserving the authentic craft. Imagine spending decades restoring a historic painting, only to watch inexpensive printed copies being sold as though they were the original. The copies might be attractive in their own way, but they could never replace the genuine article. The families of Modena understood that protecting authenticity was not simply about business. It was about honoring the countless years of patience invested by earlier generations. To safeguard this remarkable tradition, Italy established protected designations that clearly distinguish authentic traditional balsamic vinegar from other products. These protections serve an important purpose. They assure buyers that the vinegar inside the bottle has been produced according to the historic methods developed in Modena, and that it has satisfied the strict standards preserving one of Italy's greatest culinary treasures. Rather than relying upon advertising claims alone, the designation provides confidence built upon careful oversight and generations of respected craftsmanship. Today, visitors traveling to Modena have the opportunity to step inside many of the historic acetae, where this extraordinary craft continues, much as it always has. Crossing the threshold into one of these aging lofts feels less like entering a factory and more like stepping into a living museum where every barrel still performs the task for which it was built. The modern world remains outside, while inside the attic, the steady rhythm of the seasons continues almost unchanged. Many visitors are immediately struck by the fragrance waiting beneath the old roof. It is unlike anything found in an ordinary kitchen. The aroma carries gentle sweetness from the grapes, delicate acidity developed through years of aging, and the warm scent of well-seasoned wood that has quietly absorbed countless harvests. None of these fragrances dominates the others. Instead, they mingle naturally, creating an atmosphere that feels both welcoming and deeply connected to the passing years. It is difficult to describe that aroma without experiencing it firsthand, because it constantly changes as one moves through the room. Standing beside one barrel reveals slightly different notes from those found beside another. Warm summer afternoons encourage certain aromas to become more noticeable, while cooler mornings create a different impression altogether. Much like walking through an old library filled with leather-bound books, polished timber, and centuries of history, the atmosphere itself becomes part of the experience. Sunlight plays its own gentle role inside these historic attic spaces. Narrow windows positioned beneath the roof allow soft beams of light to drift across the rows of aging barrels. As the sun moves across the sky, those beams slowly shift from one side of the room to the other, quietly illuminating wood that has witnessed generations of patient care. Dust suspended in the air becomes visible for a moment before disappearing once more, reminding visitors that even the smallest details contribute to the timeless character of the loft. There is something wonderfully calming about watching that slow movement of light. Unlike electric lamps that remain constant, sunlight changes almost imperceptibly throughout the day. Morning brightness gradually softens into afternoon warmth before evening gently settles across the room. The barrels remain exactly where they have always been, accepting each new day without hurry, just as they have accepted every changing season for decades. Visitors often find themselves lowering their voices without consciously deciding to do so. No sign requests silence, no guide asks people to whisper, yet the atmosphere naturally encourages quiet conversation and thoughtful observation. Perhaps it is because everyone instinctively recognizes they are standing inside a place where patience has been valued above speed for centuries. Loud voices somehow feel out of place among barrels that have spent decades teaching a lesson in careful restraint. One particularly striking moment comes when visitors realize that many of the barrels surrounding them were already quietly aging vinegar before they themselves were born. Some may even have begun their service before their parents or grandparents entered the world. Suddenly, the craft no longer feels distant or abstract. It becomes deeply personal. The passing of time, which often feels so rapid in everyday life, seems to slow inside the asataya, inviting people to appreciate the extraordinary value of waiting. Many guests leave with more than simply a new appreciation for traditional balsamic vinegar. They depart carrying a different understanding of craftsmanship itself. They discover that excellence is not always created through larger factories, faster production, or increasingly complicated technology. Sometimes it grows from protecting simple traditions with unwavering care, allowing each generation to contribute its own small chapter without disturbing the wisdom inherited from those who came before. Perhaps that is the greatest gift offered by a visit to one of Modena's historic aging lofts. Beyond the remarkable aromas, the weathered barrels, and the softly filtered sunlight lies a quiet reminder that some of humanity's finest achievements are measured not by how quickly they are completed, but by how faithfully they are preserved. Every visitor steps back into the modern world carrying that lesson, while inside the attic, the barrels continue their patient work, welcoming another season exactly as they have for centuries. The first thing many visitors notice after spending a little time inside an old acetaya is something they had not expected to find. It is not another barrel, another aroma, or another carefully preserved tradition. It is the dust. A thin layer rests gently upon the tops of casks that have stood beneath the same roof for decades, and sometimes for well over a century. In most modern buildings, dust is seen as something to remove as quickly as possible. Here, it seems almost to belong. It quietly reminds everyone that these barrels are not part of a museum display, carefully polished every morning. They are working companions that have patiently carried out the same task for generations. The dust itself is not the story. Rather, it reflects the passage of countless ordinary days. Every beam of sunlight drifting through the attic window carries tiny particles that slowly settle upon the old timber. A single afternoon leaves almost nothing behind, but thousands of afternoons gradually create a gentle covering that speaks of years spent undisturbed. It is rather like the pages of a treasured family book, becoming softly worn through generations of careful reading. The marks are not signs of neglect. They are quiet evidence of time doing what time has always done. Looking across the rows of aging barrels, one begins to appreciate how little the surroundings have changed over the years. The same roof protects the casks through another summer. The same walls shelter them through another winter. The beams overhead have watched children grow into parents, and parents become grandparents, while the barrels beneath them continue their patient work without asking for attention. It is a place where the passing years feel almost visible. Every season arrives with its own familiar rhythm. Spring brings longer days and fresh warmth after the cooler months. Outside, vineyards slowly awaken, sending new shoots towards the sunlight as another growing season begins. Inside the attic, the barrels respond just as they always have, welcoming the gentle rise in temperature that signals another year of quiet transformation. Nothing dramatic announces the arrival of spring. It simply settles across the landscape, and the vinegar responds in its own patient way. Summer follows with long days filled with warmth. Beneath the roof, temperatures climb steadily, encouraging another small amount of moisture to leave the barrels through their microscopic pores. No one standing beside the casks can see the process taking place. There are no visible clouds of vapor rising into the air. Yet every warm afternoon contributes another tiny step in the long journey towards maturity. Nature works without drawing attention to itself, content to repeat the same quiet task year after year. Then autumn arrives, bringing cooler evenings and the excitement of another grape harvest. Vineyards once again become busy with careful hands gathering fruit that has ripened beneath the Italian sun. Fresh grape must begins another journey that will continue for decades, while older vinegar quietly advances towards even greater refinement. It is remarkable that several generations of vinegar may exist inside the same battery at the very same moment, The youngest has only recently begun its transformation, while the oldest has already spent many years resting beneath the changing seasons. Together they form an unbroken timeline stretching across decades. Winter completes the annual cycle. The attic becomes cooler, and everything slows once again. Yet slowing does not mean stopping. The barrels continue breathing. The vinegar continues evolving. Tiny chemical changes proceed at their own gentle pace, even while the countryside outside rests beneath shorter days and cooler skies. It is another reminder that nature rarely works in sudden bursts. More often, it progresses through quiet persistence. Watching this endless procession of seasons invites an interesting thought. Human beings often divide life into important moments. Birthdays, anniversaries, graduations, weddings, and holidays become milestones we eagerly anticipate. Nature follows a different calendar. It does not celebrate individual days. Instead, it patiently repeats the same dependable rhythms year after year. Traditional balsamic vinegar has always belonged to that slower calendar, allowing every season to contribute its own small part, without asking any one year to accomplish everything. Imagine reading one page of a very long novel each evening. After a single night, the story barely seems to move. After a week, only a few chapters have passed. Yet after many months, an entire world has unfolded one page at a time. The aging of traditional balsamic vinegar follows that same quiet pattern. No single season creates greatness by itself. Excellence emerges because countless ordinary seasons patiently build upon one another. This explains why experienced master distillers never speak about hurrying the process. The question simply does not arise. Asking whether authentic traditional balsamic vinegar could be produced more quickly is rather like asking whether an ancient oak tree could reach full maturity in only a few summers. One may grow the tree faster, but something essential would always be missing. Time itself has become one of the ingredients. Throughout history, people have naturally searched for ways to improve efficiency. Better tools allow fields to be cultivated more quickly. Faster transport carries goods farther than ever before. Computers perform calculations that once required many hours of careful work. In countless areas of life, these improvements have brought enormous benefits, yet traditional balsamic vinegar stands as a gentle reminder that not every process becomes better simply because it becomes faster. Machines can stir, pump, heat, cool, and measure with astonishing precision. They can monitor temperatures to fractions of a degree and record every stage of production with perfect accuracy. What they cannot manufacture is the passing of 25 summers, followed by 25 winters. They cannot persuade wood to carry half a century of quiet history within its grain. They cannot ask generations of families to add their own careful stewardship to a tradition already centuries old. Imagine placing a young violin beside one that has been lovingly played by skilled musicians for 200 years. Both may produce beautiful music, yet the older instrument carries a depth shaped by time that cannot simply be manufactured. The difference lies not only in craftsmanship, but also in the countless years during which the wood has continued changing almost imperceptibly. Traditional balsamic vinegar shares that same relationship with time. Its greatest qualities are earned rather than created. This may be one of the most meaningful lessons hidden inside the attic vinegar lofts of Modena. The barrels never compete with the calendar. They never struggle against the changing seasons. Instead, they welcome every passing year as another opportunity for quiet improvement. Dust settles, sunlight shifts across the floor. Summer gives way to winter before returning once more. Through it all, the vinegar patiently becomes something that could never exist without the faithful repetition of nature's endless rhythm. Perhaps that is why visitors often leave these historic lofts feeling unexpectedly peaceful. They arrive expecting to learn about vinegar, yet many depart carrying a deeper appreciation for patience itself. The barrels have quietly demonstrated that some of the finest achievements in life are not the result of rushing towards the finish, but of allowing ordinary days, ordinary seasons, and ordinary years to accumulate until they become something truly extraordinary. There comes a moment when people first begin to understand why authentic, traditional balsamic vinegar is spoken about with such admiration. It is usually not when they taste it, nor when they see the beautifully aged barrels resting beneath the rooftops of Modena. The real understanding often arrives much later, when they pause to consider the simple passage of time. Every drop resting inside the bottle has quietly waited through years that can never be repeated. Summers have come and gone. Winters have settled across the countryside before giving way to spring once again. Children have grown into adults. Families have celebrated weddings, welcomed new generations, and said farewell to loved ones. Through all of those ordinary moments of life, the vinegar has continued its patient transformation, one season at a time. Remarkably, think that someone tasting traditional balsamic vinegar today may be enjoying work that began before many of today's technologies even existed. While the outside world welcomed mobile telephones, personal computers, and the internet, the vinegar remained beneath the same roof, quietly following the rhythm it had always known. It never hurried to catch up with modern life, because it had no reason to do so. Its greatest strength has always been the willingness to ignore urgency and instead embrace patience with complete confidence. When people hear that authentic traditional balsamic vinegar may spend 25 years, or even much longer, inside its battery of barrels, those numbers can almost lose their meaning. 25 years sounds impressive, yet it is difficult to picture such a span of time in everyday life. Consider, however, what usually happens during those years. A child born on the day fresh grape must first enter the largest barrel may finish university before the vinegar is finally ready for bottling. Someone beginning a career may reach retirement before another exceptionally old batch completes its remarkable journey. These comparisons help transform abstract numbers into something deeply human. Patience inside an acetea is therefore measured very differently from patience elsewhere. Waiting a few hours for bread to rise or several months for a garden to bloom feels perfectly ordinary. Waiting decades requires another way of thinking altogether. It asks people to place their trust in a future they may never fully witness. That outlook has shaped the families of Modena for centuries, encouraging them to think beyond immediate rewards and instead consider the lasting value of careful stewardship. Perhaps this is why so many families speak not in terms of individual harvests, but in generations. A vineyard may produce grapes every autumn, yet the finest traditional balsamic vinegar asks people to look much farther ahead. Parents understand they are caring for barrels that will one day belong to their children. Those children eventually become parents themselves, preparing the same barrels for yet another generation. The work never truly begins or ends with any single individual. Instead, every caretaker quietly adds another chapter to a story already centuries old. Imagine building a magnificent stone bridge across a wide river, knowing it will serve travelers for hundreds of years. The builders understand they are creating something whose greatest purpose lies in the future rather than the present. Long after their own footsteps have disappeared, countless others will continue crossing the bridge without ever knowing the names of those who first laid the stones. Traditional balsamic vinegar follows that same generous philosophy. Each generation contributes something meaningful, while accepting that the fullest rewards may belong to those who follow. This long view changes the relationship people have with the barrels themselves. They are never treated as possessions to be used carelessly or replaced casually. Instead, they become trusted companions, passed respectfully from one generation to the next. Every small repair, every careful inspection, and every thoughtful decision reflects an understanding that today's actions will shape the vinegar many years into the future. Looking after the battery becomes an act of responsibility rather than ownership. By this stage in the journey, it also becomes easier to appreciate the extraordinary partnership taking place inside every barrel. Wood contributes its gentle influence through years of quiet contact. Air enters and leaves through microscopic pores almost too small to imagine. The changing seasons steadily concentrate the vinegar while encouraging countless natural transformations. None of these forces competes with the others. They work together with remarkable harmony, each contributing something that cannot easily be replaced. It is rather like watching skilled stonemasons construct an old cathedral. One shapes individual blocks of stone, another carefully positions them, a third creates intricate carvings, while others raise beams, install windows, and strengthen the roof. No single craftsperson builds the cathedral alone. The finished building emerges because many different skills quietly support one another over many years. Traditional balsamic vinegar develops in much the same way. Wood, air, temperature, beneficial microorganisms, evaporation, and time each contribute their own essential part, until together they create something no single element could achieve by itself. This understanding gradually changes the role of the master distiller as well. Earlier in the journey, it may have seemed as though the distiller was directing every stage of production. Yet after spending time inside the attic vinegar lofts, another picture begins to emerge. The master distiller is less a controller than a caretaker. Nature performs the greatest share of the work. The responsibility of the distiller is to observe carefully, make thoughtful decisions when needed, and avoid disturbing processes that have already been unfolding successfully for generations. That distinction is surprisingly important. Modern thinking often celebrates complete control. We admire technology that allows every variable to be measured, adjusted, and perfected. Traditional balsamic vinegar quietly suggests another approach. Sometimes wisdom lies not in controlling every detail, but in recognizing when nature already knows exactly what to do. The master distiller becomes a trusted guardian rather than an impatient director, allowing the vinegar to follow the rhythm established long before any living person entered the attic. There is a quiet humility within that role. Every experienced producer understands that no amount of personal skill can replace the passing decades. They may guide the process with remarkable judgment, Yet they cannot ask 25 years to become 5. They cannot persuade winter to arrive early or convince summer to remain a little longer. Their greatest achievement comes from respecting those limits rather than resisting them. Standing once more among the rows of patiently aging barrels, one begins to see the entire tradition in a different light. The story has never really been about vinegar alone. It has always been about relationships. The relationship between people and nature, between one generation and the next, between carefully chosen wood and slowly changing air, between the present moment and a future that may still be decades away. Every bottle eventually leaving Modena carries those relationships within it. Its value comes not simply from age, but from the countless acts of thoughtful stewardship that protected it throughout its remarkable journey. Every drop represents years of quiet waiting, careful observation, and deep respect for a process that refuses to be hurried. Perhaps that is the most enduring lesson offered by the Attic vinegar lofts of Modena. They remind us that patience is not merely the ability to wait. True patience is the willingness to care faithfully for something while allowing time to complete the work that only time can do. Inside every wooden barrel, that lesson continues unfolding one season after another, just as it has for nearly 1,000 years. The story of traditional balsamic vinegar does not truly end when the bottle is finally sealed. In many ways, that moment simply marks the completion of one remarkable journey and the beginning of another. Every bottle carries with it the patient work of nature, the thoughtful care of generations, and the quiet understanding that some of life's finest creations cannot be hurried. The vineyards, the changing seasons, the carefully chosen woods, and the steady passage of time all remain part of every drop. What eventually reaches the table is far more than a seasoning. It is the result of countless ordinary days that slowly became something extraordinary through consistency rather than speed. Walk through the streets of Modena today, and modern life unfolds much as it does in cities across the world. Cars move along roads that once welcomed horses and carts. People hurry to work, children walk to school, and visitors fill the cafes and market squares. Yet above many of those familiar streets, beneath weathered roof tiles that have sheltered families for generations, another rhythm continues almost unchanged. Barrels still rest quietly inside their batteries. Summer still encourages gentle evaporation. Winter still slows the pace of change. Fresh grape must begin another long journey, while older vinegar continues maturing exactly where it has rested for decades. Although the world outside has changed beyond recognition, these attic lofts remain faithful to traditions that have endured for nearly 1,000 years. Perhaps that continuity is one of the most remarkable achievements of all. Many historic crafts have disappeared as newer methods replaced older ones, while others survive only inside museums where they can be admired but no longer practiced. Traditional balsamic vinegar has followed another path. It remains a living tradition, protected not because people refuse to embrace progress, but because they recognized that some methods had already reached a remarkable level of perfection. Every harvest begins another chapter. Every careful transfer between barrels honors those who came before, and every generation quietly prepares the way for those who will one day continue the work. Standing inside one of these attic vinegar lofts, surrounded by rows of beautifully aged barrels, it becomes easy to realize that every cask holds far more than slowly maturing vinegar. Each one carries years of observation, countless changing seasons, careful hands, and family traditions that have been passed from parents to children for centuries. The wood remembers every harvest that has traveled through it. The changing temperatures have left their gentle influence year after year. Even the smallest barrel at the end of the battery contains traces of countless earlier seasons, each contributing another layer to a story that has never truly stopped unfolding. It is rather like walking through an ancient forest where no single tree tells the whole story. One began growing long before another appeared, while younger trees continue rising beneath older branches. Together they create something far greater than any one tree could achieve by itself. The barrel battery follows that same beautiful pattern. Every generation contributes its own small part. Every season adds another quiet layer of refinement, and every careful decision becomes part of a tradition that stretches across centuries rather than years. Looking back across this remarkable journey, it becomes clear that grapes alone could never have created traditional balsamic vinegar. Wood alone could not have done it. Neither could changing temperatures, beneficial microorganisms, or the careful judgment of master distillers. Each played an essential role, yet none could have succeeded without the one companion that remained present from beginning to end. Time quietly connected every stage, allowing nature to perform work that no shortcut, machine, or modern invention has ever managed to replace. Year after year, without drawing attention to itself, it slowly transformed fresh grape must into one of the world's most treasured culinary creations. Perhaps that is the lasting lesson hidden beneath the rooftops of Modena. True craftsmanship is rarely measured by how quickly something can be completed. More often, it is measured by the willingness to protect a tradition, to respect the natural pace of change, and to understand that some of life's greatest rewards arrive only after years of faithful care. Every bottle of authentic traditional balsamic vinegar quietly carries that lesson into the present, reminding us that lasting excellence is built one ordinary season at a time until patience itself becomes part of the flavor. Thank you for listening to the Sleepy Mind channel. I hope you enjoyed learning about traditional balsamic vinegar.